welcome back to MVN, and as the title of this video would suggest, today is a bit of a roundup on what it's been like living with the Macan Turbo. The reason I bought this car was because I was becoming a family man. I am now a dad of almost 9 months now, in fact, and this was the family wagon. We brought it down to MVN because I have augmented it somewhat to apply a matte PPF to the car, which has completely transformed the way the car looks and feels. I'll tell you inside why I ended up doing this. But first of all, let me just show you around at the work, and then we'll hit the road and tell you what it's been like to live with this car as a daily driver and a family car. So just as a spot of context, I've had this car for a year now. Or shall I say, my wife and I have had this car for a year now. It is predominantly my wife's car, and we use it, as I mentioned, as the family wagon. But the reason we bought it is because when my wife isn't driving it and I wish to go out and use it as a daily and enjoy it, this car is a lot more like a hot hatch on stilts, or actually a 911 on stilts, than it is an SUV. Yes, its four-wheel drive ability is amazing, and it has got me out of some sticky situations when I've been on rainy fields, but the way this thing handles is incredible. Anyway, we'll speak about that when we go for a drive shortly. Just as a recap as well, this is the Turbo Performance pack. You can kind of think of it as a Turbo S. It brings another 40 brake horsepower to the table over the regular V6 Turbo, and another 34 pounds-feet of torque, which takes it up to 443 pounds-feet of torque. So it doesn't hang around. And I've recently made some augmentations to it, namely the satin PPF. First of all, I was inspired by the new Audi RS6. When I went to film it, it was in this stunning satin grey, and it was just amazing in terms of it showing up the sculptures of the car. It photographed amazingly well, and it was brilliant on video. And the base colour of the car reminded me of the base colour of this car, and I thought, do you know what? We could probably do a pretty good job of applying a matte PPF film here at MVN London to transform the look and feel of the car. Now, we've actually applied matte to the majority of the bodywork, but I think what's really helped this pop is leaving key components in their original gloss finish. Take, for example, these splitters here on the air intake. These are still gloss, and this front part of the bumper here is still gloss, but importantly on the sides of the doors you've got these sort of inlays on the lower half of the door sills there, which have also been left in gloss. And when you stand away from it, I think it's all tied in quite nicely with the gloss on the windows. All in all, I think it just sets it off really well. Now, I'll tell you inside one of the other reasons once we get out on the road as to why I've applied this film. It might sound silly, but it was just something that both myself and my wife wanted to do to help essentially differentiate the car. But just look at how it's transformed the lines of the car. All of a sudden, the shapes and the sculpture and the formations of the design just pop incredibly well. The thing with gloss reflections is that, well, inherently they actually reflect a little bit too much. And so let's take, for example, this conveniently placed DB11 here, AMR version. It has a lovely gloss finish all over it, and it looks fantastic. But there's something about the high spots on these crease lines here that seem to get a little bit lost compared to the highlights on this. I don't know what it is about matte. It just shows up sculpture beautifully. You'll have to forgive that random noise. We've just had a new osmosis unit installed over there so that we can clean these cars in extra clean water. Anyway, the other addition to the car, preparing it for winter, is installing the Michelin Latitude Sport 3 tyres. I've been dealing with some standing water lately. These things are incredible. They displace pools of water as if it's not there. Back home, we live down some pretty dirty country lanes, and every now and again I get caught out when I'm driving to and from MVN London, and basically I'm not worrying now about coming across any phantom standing water. So we've added those on the car as well, just in time for the winter season. Now, at the minute, the baby seat is not in the back, but I shall talk about that when I get in the car. In fact, I shall probably fit it to the car. Look, there's our little mirror so we can see the little man once he's in there. I shall probably fit that in there, and then when I go for a drive you'll be able to see it in the back and sort of contextualize further about what the other side of my life is like, and I shall talk about how practical this car has been. But I just wanted to show you around this while we've got some great light as to the difference and the impact a satin paint protection film can have on a car. Because if you are thinking about having PPF on there and you haven't considered matte, Really, it does exactly the same job as paint protection film, protecting it against any stone chips and dirt and grime and fallout, but if you wish to, you can have a completely different finish to your existing car without too much hassle. And then the inside as well, we've also done a ceramic coat on the inside, keeping it super clean, because as people mentioned when I first bought this car, they were saying that this is not a Gene or baby friendly car. I agree with you if you don't put the appropriate protection on it before you use it, but believe me, this gets heavy use and there is no trace of any Gene stains or baby food stains for that matter, just because the solution that we've applied to this allows the majority of anything that falls on it to just wipe off. Yeah, allowing this otherwise impractical interior to be rather practical. So, let me know what you think about the satin finish in the comments below. I shall waste no more time talking on the exterior, and we'll take you for a drive and discuss what it's been like living with this compact SUV.
Knock that over into manual transmission. So welcome to the inside of the wonderful, dynamic Macan Turbo Performance. Let's just touch on that word 1 second. Why isn't this car called a Turbo S? I still haven't managed to get to the bottom of this. The Performance is a standalone product. Fast motorbike, he's really on it. The whole performance naming strategy, and why, unlike their other top-tier turbo cars, they haven't referred to it as a Turbo S. I still don't know why. This is a standalone product as well. This isn't a sort of performance pack bolt-on to a Macan Turbo. This is its own product code, its own standalone car. You can very much think of this as a Macan Turbo S, but for some reason, Porsche decided to call it the Macan Turbo Performance. Anyway, semantics aside, performance indeed. This thing really is. I said it when I was back at MVN. It's a lot more like a hot hatch on stilts. Now, when I was doing the research into buying this car, interestingly, I came across some information that has now come to light and now made sense. So what explains the extraordinary dynamics of this compact SUV is actually the original design brief for the car. Now, you'd expect from the outset that Porsche were looking to make a smaller, more compact Cayenne, because ultimately that's the only other SUV within the Porsche family. However, apparently the design brief was to make a larger 911 rather than a more compact Cayenne, and that explains everything about this car. When you hear that, you're like, that makes so much sense. That's why this thing is so agile. That's why it's so nimble. It's why it seems to punch way above its weight for the class that it sits in. Now, SUV generally stands for sports utility vehicle. Porsche, being Porsche, really put the emphasis on the sports bit. That's not to say that it isn't also a utility vehicle. It is practical. I'll come around to the true practicalities of this car shortly. I'm not sure if you've clocked, but I do have a baby seat in the back. I think that's the first time any shred of evidence of me being a dad has made its way onto the channel. We'll talk about that shortly, but let's just get on to the performance. As I mentioned in NVN, it's more like a hot hatch on stilts. The way this thing handles, particularly when you engage the PASM, the Porsche Active Stability Management. Now, if I go down here and put it into Sport Plus, what it does by default is actually activate the stiffest setting of the suspension, which for your average British B-road you don't need. So you put on your Sports Plus button and then you dial back the sports suspension to make it a lot more compliant when you're bouncing over these lumps and bumps in these roads. Then the shift speed of the 7-speed twin-clutch gearbox improves, as does the throttle response and just overall engine pickup. And then what you get yourself is listen to that. What a wonderful thing. It's so cool. Now, the power delivery of this actually took a little bit of getting used to. I'm not about to say that because it was too fast. I'm approaching a big flood here. This is where the practical part comes in. I'm putting this little off-road button. That, yes, go anywhere. And then 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds, straight out of the flood. That's what's great about this thing. It really is an SUV. Back to the S bit. When you've got all of these systems activated and you've dialed off that extra hard suspension, this thing comes alive. 7-speed twin-clutch gearbox. If you watch the channel regularly, you'll know that pleases me greatly, having a gearbox that changes gear exactly when I want it to. I generally have this car in manual, hence when I began the video, I pushed the drive select stick over to the left, which engages manual gear changing only. This will never change up or down on its own now. I like to be able to interact with it. Seamless shift. Porsche's PDK, aka twin clutch gearbox, is one of, if not the best gearbox or twin clutch gearbox in the world. And when it comes to the application of a sports car, it just dials in the connectivity between you and what the drivetrain and engine is doing just to another degree that you wouldn't otherwise get from your average automatic gearbox. I love that. They could have got a little bit lazy and put in a conventional torque converter, but it just wouldn't have suited the character of the car. I mean, listen to how quickly this shifts down. It's great. Now back to what I was saying just before we went through that micro flood, is the power delivery took a little bit of adapting to. Now normally on this channel when I say that, it's because the power of the vehicle in question that I'm driving at that time is so ridiculous that it takes your breath away. Not necessarily the case with this car. I mean, it's over 440 horsepower, but it weighs 2,000 kilograms, so it's not doing 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. It's actually just under 4.5 seconds, which I think for a heavy car is actually pretty impressive. No, the power delivery is interesting because it's more akin, and hear me out, to the characteristics of classic Porsches. Do not confuse that with slow. What I mean is, historically, Porsche's delivery of power has typically been mid to high range of the power band, meaning you generally up the revs a lot more often than you would be in most cars in order to get the most power or performance and response out of the engine. Despite the fact that this is a heavily turbocharged car and it does have plenty of torque available low down, still that major punch, the majority of the power and acceleration punch that you get from this car is interestingly mid to high rev band. And I didn't expect that from a turbocharged car. That generally is more akin to naturally aspirated high revving cars. The other great thing about this car is once it's up to speed, and let's not be silly about this, it gets up to speed very quickly. The way that it carries the momentum through corners. I actually watched an early video of this car. I think it was Steve Sutcliffe from Autocar was driving this car, and he pitched it against a BMW 1M on a racetrack, and it came within the same second of that car in terms of lap times. I think that's a good way of setting a spot of context as to the agility of this car when it comes to speed, performance, and then of course you have the practicality of it being an SUV. It's a wonderful thing. I think it doesn't sound too bad either. Considering it's a V6 and it's heavily turbocharged, it's not too bad. Of course, this isn't victim of the fuel particulate filters yet. That will be applied to the new facelifted Macan Turbo, which has recently launched. I'm not sure how that will sound in comparison to this. Don't get me wrong, it's not like this sounds like a naturally aspirated V12 or a GT3 or anything like that, and still I think it has a nice enough character to keep the driver's side of your brain engaged, and that's what this car is all about. Now, this is an opportune moment to transition into the practical family side of things. One of the reasons that we bought this car was because when the family isn't in it, and I'm using it as a practical daily driver, it's still great. Whew. First of all, to smash through floods like that, but it's still great to grab it by the scruff of its neck and enjoy it. Now, up until the ownership of this car, I can't say I've ever really been an SUV man. Yes, I appreciate their vast breadth of ability, but typically when I get in a car, I want it to sort of excite me, and when I've stepped out of it, I want it to remind me that I've definitely just been for a substantial pedal. However, this world of SUVs is distinctly evolving. You know, platforms like the Lamborghini Urus, I know that Audi will be launching an RS Q8. But one of the cars which has me really fascinated is the new Aston Martin Dbs. Now, I'm yet to see the actual car, the finished car, but looking at the teaser shots and picking up on insider information along the way, sounds like a very interesting platform. And size-wise, while it is bigger than this car, I don't think it's quite as big as your fully fledged Range Rover. So that car might sit right in the prime spot to be the dynamic luxury family Uber hatch. Let's see. And then there's the final point, which I started with at the very beginning of this video, which is why I wrapped it satin in the first place. Funny thing happens when you own a car, you begin to spot them everywhere. The Macan is really popular. It's so weird. Everywhere I go. The other day, I parked in a parent and child parking bay. There was about 12 car parking spaces there. And of the 12 spaces, 4 of them were filled with Macans. And so you start seeing this car everywhere. In a way, it's testament to how great this car is, what a complete package it is. And so, I began seeing Macans absolutely everywhere. And while it's great that Porsche have made this car relatively accessible, you can't help but want to differentiate yourself just a little bit. So I thought, why not? Why don't we wrap this car in a satin paint protection film? Winter's coming up, so it'll do an extra job of protecting the paint anyway, and on top of that, it'll differentiate the car. So there we are. Let me know in the questions and comments below what more you would like to see, not just from the Macan, but from the channel and the podcast and things in future. There's some pretty big plans on the horizon, which I'm very excited to share with you in the near future. But now I'm off to a different country, somewhere exciting to drive something special that I shall share with you very soon. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ciao!